So, fun fact, the question that you see on your bulletin right now, the bulletin cover, that is not the original question that I got on the card. And I actually want to start by kind of paraphrasing the question that I actually got so that you can have a little more nuance. So what we're talking about today, so on this card, it said, I have a friend who is a neuroscientist, and she says that consciousness is just a bunch of electrical signals in the brain. So how do we understand this? With what we believe, with popular culture, things like near-death experiences, because there isn't such thing as a soul detector. Bulletin cover was my attempt at distilling this into a question that would fit on your bulletin. The first thing that I do want to point out with our question today is its similarity to some of the questions that we have looked at in the last month. They have quite a bit in common, I think, which you will be able to hear. How do I know that prayer works? How do I know that miracles are real? How do I know that I have a soul instead of electrical signals? And I don't know if that question about soul detectors was meant to be like a flippant aside or not, but I think it is very telling, as is the way this whole question starts. It starts off, I have a friend who is a neuroscientist who says that what we know about consciousness has to start and end with knowledge that we collect by using the scientific method. And a soul detector is just an imaginary instrument that, if it existed, would allow us to use that way of knowing to prove what is a tenet of our faith. That something about us is everlasting. That we are more than electrical signals. Now, unfortunately, and unlike last week, where there were many interesting scientific studies that showed evidence of the effects of prayer, for instance, that's what we talked about last week, how there actually is some overlap in ways of knowing in that part of our faith. This one, there's none. There's nothing at all. There are no studies. There is no laboratory evidence. There is nothing that will prove to us that what we read about in our two scripture verses today is objectively true. That at creation, God breathes something into human beings that is different from the rest of creation. That there is a something more that Paul was talking about. There's a self that's somehow inside of the tent of our physical existence. Yet it's not separate from it. He says we will never be found unclothed, or, just in our translation, they just go for it and say naked. We will not be found that way. Instead, we will be resurrected into a body that a spiritual body, a new creation body that we can enjoy for eternity. No one will ever prove this is true using research. My friend is a neuroscientist, and she says that consciousness is electrical signals. Well, yes. And she can prove that. But the question that our faith asks is, but is it more than that? Is it yes and? There is something, it's a bit of theology, it's called the Wesleyan quadrilateral. It's invented by, Methodists started writing about it about 100, 150 years ago. Maybe more than that, actually. But it describes how we in the Christian faith go about knowing things. It comes down to four things. That's why it's a quadrilateral, which they say scripture, tradition, reason, and experience. And the basis of our faith is our scripture. The reason why we believe that the basis of our faith is the scripture is because we believe that it was inspired by God. And sidebar, that is an inherently unprovable claim. The scientific method is based on what can be observed, and our faith is based on a belief that there is something that cannot be observed. And so what we do with this scripture, so we receive the scripture, and then we interpret it through the traditions that have been handed down to us from the billions of people who have come before us in the faith. And if you think I'm exaggerating, I looked it up. It is estimated that, and I picked 2000 BCE, where I will tell you that the Hebrew traditions likely go back further than that. But just from 2000 BCE, they've estimated that there's between 70 and 80 billion people that have been born. So yes, the billions of people that have come before us in the faith, and that is where our tradition is handed down to us from. And so what do we do with the tradition then? We interpret both our scripture and the traditions about the scripture through reason, our own reason, and experience, our own experience of the faith, the community of the church, of what is true and important in life. And of course, there is room, as you can see, for the collection of evidence and for scientific thinking within the reason section of this. There's a reason why it's there. We cannot go without it, or we're all in a lot of trouble. But when it comes to our faith, we do have to face the fact that that is not the primary way through which we know what is true, through which we know God. And it's also why we know that what we believe will probably never stand up in a laboratory, but that means that it is also not contained there. And honestly, switching from how we know to what we're talking about knowing here, it actually doesn't help that there is a wide and interesting variety of things that even just our own Judeo-Christian faith has believed about the soul in particular. In fact, the way that it was understood in the Old Testament, like if we want to start back there, think about the reading that we just heard about the creation of humans. It's God breathed life into the human. And at that time, the soul was understood as something more, like it's the something that animates the body, but it was much more closely related. They did not think about one without the other. And it is crazily, like way more in line with what neuroscientists today think than what you tend to find in the New Testament. In fact, process theologians, some people who are in the sciences write about their belief in the soul and in the resurrection in ways that are really closely aligned with what you get in some of the older Old Testament scripture. Like the word for soul in Hebrew, literally, it's nephesh, and translated literally, it means throat. It's where God breathed that breath of life in. It's where the breath is. And that's kind of the most common understanding through the Old Testament. And there were definitely others. There's a ghost at one point. We'll get to that. But the development of ideas of the soul, and maybe even what happens after you die through the Old Testament. That's actually another fascinating thing. And I want to actually refer you, if you want to hear more about that, there is a sermon on YouTube, on our YouTube page. It's called What About Hell? And that traces sort of the development of ideas of the afterlife. And that is related to the soul and what people have thought happens to it along those years. But what I do want to talk about is that things don't change radically until the Roman Empire and the transition between the Jewish faith and the Christian faith. Because what happened is that we picked up a bunch of Greek philosophy along the way. Neoplatonism is one, if you want to go read about that some more. But they had this very dualistic belief about what the soul was. They thought the soul was like a different entity. It was like a different substance. It's like trapped in the body. The soul is good, body is bad. And it's just sort of in there. And this diverges a lot from what you hear in Genesis. But it has certainly fed into and produced a lot of what popular culture sees as the soul today. Like I said, there's this whole idea of ghosts. There are a startling lack of ghosts in the Bible, to say. There's literally one in the Old Testament. And it's like a king, and the point of the story is that this king is bad. And so he is messing up, and he wants to summon a previous wise king from the dead, and so he gets a witch come and do it, and this king is like, what are you doing? And he leaves. That's it. That is it for biblical ghosts. But so I'm sorry, I just lost my place here talking about the ghost. But I'd actually love to trace more the development of the idea that we see in popular culture today, that our soul is this thing that peels off out of our body and flies off to heaven when we die. And because Paul and the New Testament authors are very clear that what they believe is that we will be raised like Jesus. That's what is waiting for us. And most Christians interpret that as a resurrection of the body. Our actual bodies, transformed into a new creation, into an eternal form. And the gap between those two expectations is super anxiety producing for people in seminary, I can tell you that. So a lot of things people don't want to hear at a funeral, that's one of them. But it's produced a lot of interesting theology along the way. People want to know what happens to us the moment we die. In the meantime, that sounds like a big chunk of time. We're talking about between when we die and then the end of time, when God recreates everything and heaven comes to earth. And some people have done a hybrid thing. They say, well, yes, you have a soul, but it is asleep until the resurrection. For some people, that's metaphorical. Other people, that's literal. There's also this scene in Revelation, which, to be fair, is notoriously metaphorical. But there is a scene in Revelation where the souls of the martyrs are waiting under the altar of God for justice to happen on their behalf. So some people want to say, no, that's a great idea. It is a literal thing. So they want both the soul winging up to heaven and also the bodily resurrection when the time comes. And other people will just go hardcore and they will go ahead and tell you, no, you just don't exist without your body. That's a hard thing to wrap your head around. But you know what? The point of that is that you won't know this. You will jump from one moment to the next. So you don't need to worry about that. But then what about the communion of saints? Because that is another biblical promise, that the communion of saints surrounds us all the time. And most of us with or without meaning it, probably think that that means the souls of those who have gone before us. There's a lot of our music, there's a lot of our liturgy that is written using that language. The language of soul crossing over. For process theologians, this is not a problem because they think the resurrection is happening all the time. Because for them, it is a spiritual body that is resurrected, so that can happen right away. There's no waiting involved there. It's not going to have anything to do with our physical matter of our bodies, and they have a point. Those bodies are gone in a relatively short blink of time compared to the ages. There is mystery there. And I could just keep giving you options. You know why? Because it is not spelled out incredibly clearly in our scriptures. That's giving a lot of room for different traditions to pop up within our church. The things that are spelled out incredibly clearly are that we are not alone, that there is a communion of saints. Are those saints coming back in some quantum physics way from the end after the resurrection? Who knows? Maybe they are. But that is a promise. Is the first thing that we see when we die going to be Jesus and the people we love? Yes. That is a promise. Are we going to be hanging out under an altar? Probably not. I will stand up here and say that. When I think about it, actually, the thing that always comes to mind for me is the raising of Jairus' daughter. I lost my father a few years ago, so sometimes this connects emotionally with that. But so Jairus' daughter was raised from the dead in this story. Not in the last resurrection. But she was brought back to life. And when she awoke, she did so in a room surrounded by those that she loved. Her whole family was there. And the first thing she saw was Jesus. That is what the resurrection will be like. That's what I believe. I'm not going to argue about how physical it is. That's just me. That may be something that you want to think more about. And I want to tell you, you've got options. The church has many traditions for you for that. I don't think our faith is like a buffet, but I think in cases like this, we are free to browse. We take our reason and we take our experience and we take tradition and we come to our scripture through these lenses. And they guide us in what we believe. Would it be easier to have lab results and a soul detector? Yes, it probably would, especially for us. We are modern people. We are used to thinking that way. It would be easier. That's how we're used to knowing things. But it is not how we know faith. That's not how we primarily know God. There is a point where we do have to let go and have faith in order to know.